So let's continue on by taking a look at the additional parts on the next page for example number 1. Remember, this dealt with two classes of students that were scoring very differently on exams. We saw that class 1 had scores that were very spread out from each other, and class 2 had scores that were all kind of clumped together. So we have these 4 measures of dispersion, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at how I compute the range and how I compute the IQR, those first two. Notice here, on part C, I'm going to be asked directly to compute and then interpret the range for each of the data sets that I had up above. Well, if I look at the definition in the box above, I can see that range is just defined as the difference between the largest and the smallest entries in a data set. Okay, so this should be pretty easy to compute. Notice, if I wanted to go ahead and find the range for class number 1, so I'll call that range 1, I would first have to go back and find the largest data value and the smallest data value in the data set. So let's see. For the first class, the largest value is 132, and the smallest appears to be 85. So my range would be calculated by just doing 132 minus 85. That turns into a total amount of 47. And I'm going to put units on there of points, since those were scores on an exam. Now, to interpret this is pretty easy. I would just say something like, the scores for class number 1 are spread over a span of 47 points, right? That is, from lowest to highest, there's a 47-point gap from lowest to highest. All the other scores are kind of spread out over that span of points. Okay, so the range here is actually super simple. Notice, you could probably go ahead and calculate range number 2. In fact, I'm going to ask you, pause the video, see if you can go ahead and record what range 2 actually is, and provide an interpretation for it. When you hit unpause, you'll see me work through the solution. Okay, so with range number 2, we should have gotten that the highest score in the class was 111, the low score was 109, and the difference between those is a total of 2 points. So we would say that the scores for class 2 are spread over a span of 2 points. So again, we can see here that the range is giving me some numerical representation of how much spread there actually is in the data set. And so, of course, class 1 has a lot of spread. Class 2 has not very much spread. Now, there are obviously some disadvantages to using the range, in that the range only really used 2 of the data points. Right? So like, I could make class 2 look like the scores were super spread out if I just had one score of 0. But in actuality, most of the scores are actually pretty clumped together. So what we'll often see is that out of this list here, the range is going to not be used very often. We're kind of often going to just ignore the range because it doesn't take into account enough of the data set to really be representative of what's happening with all the data. We'll see it used from time to time, but not very often. However, a value that will be often used is what we call the interquartile range, or the IQR. Now, if you look here at this definition, the IQR is defined as the distance between the third and the first quartile of a data set. Okay, but what the heck is a third and a first quartile? Well, I'm going to go ahead down here and draw out a nice simple picture to try to help illustrate this point. So if I have a number line here, I can immediately imagine lining up all of my test scores for a class on this number line. On the very left side, I could put down the smallest score. On the right side, I could put down the largest score. So I'll call those my min and my max scores. Now we know that the median score is going to be right here smack dab in the middle. And that right there is actually what is going to be referred to as Q number 2. You can see up above that the middle quartile of a data set, what we call Q2, is just the median of the whole data set. Okay, pretty easy. Now notice if I want to find Q1, that's the median, or the middle, of the lower half of the data set. So notice down here, from min to median is my lower half, and if I chop that in half, that creates Q number 1. Similarly, Q number 3 is the median of the upper half. And so with these 3 red values that I have here, you'll notice that I can see that the data set has been broken up into kind of 4 distinct regions, or quarters, which is why we call these quartiles. The interesting thing then is that if each of these provides a split of the data set into these different portions, like the median splits the data set in half, so I know that 50% of the data is down here, and another 50%, other half of the data is up here. Well, if I split that 50% in half, then notice that that means that 25% of the data would be here, another 25% would be here, because the bottom 50 got chopped right in half. Similarly, I'm going to have 25% up here. So I'm kind of just using these red values to kind of like divide up my data set into these equally sized portions. Now, when we talk about the IQR, my IQR is going to actually just be this distance between the third and the first quartile. So if I go here and I calculate this distance, how far is it from Q3 down to Q1? This is going to be my IQR. So calculating the IQR is going to require that I have these values of Q1 and Q3. So let's see how we would actually be able to do this. I'm going to go ahead and focus first here on class number 1 and think about how I can find these values. Okay, again, I know I'm going to need to find Q number 1, I'm going to need to find Q number 3, and then once I have those, I should be able to calculate my IQR. Now to find these values is really easy because again, I can just use my calculator to do this. I'm going to go ahead and switch back to my calculator, and when here, I can go ahead and see that if I go back and I do a calculation here, I'm going to do list 1. You'll see that while I get an average, I can also see that down near the bottom I see a minimum X, that is a minimum test score for my first class. I have a Q1 value, and remember if I scroll down I can see, oh wow, these are actually all of the values that would be on this number line. The min, all the different Qs, and the max. That's exactly what I have right here. Now I just need to record Q1 and Q3. So that's 93 and 126. So Q1 is 93, Q3 is 126, and the IQR would be defined as the distance between those. So I would do Q3 minus Q1, and that would leave me with a total value of 33. And notice each of these has units of points. Now to interpret this value is actually not too difficult. Notice that the IQR is telling me about kind of where the middle of the data set is located, or how far the middle of the data set is spread out. But it's not just any amount of the middle. Notice that the IQR covers what percentage of the data? Well, it covers 50%. So to interpret my IQR, I could state this. The middle 50% of the scores from class 1 are spread over a span of 33 points. That's it. Notice it's very similar to how we interpreted the range, except now it's not for the whole data set, but it's for the middle 50% of the data set. Can you go ahead right now and try to pause the video and see if you can actually come up with a interpretation for class number 2 as well as the IQR value? Go ahead, hit pause, see if you can work through that. And when you hit unpause, you'll see me going through the solution. Okay, so hopefully you got answers that looked somewhat like this. Class number 2 had a Q1 of 109.5, a Q3 of 110.5, and so my IQR just came out as one single point. So my interpretation would say that the middle 50% of the scores from class 2 are spread out over a span of 1 point. Notice that this is showing me again that there's a lot more variability or spread in the scores from Class 1 than there are in Class 2. Although here specifically we're talking about the middle 50% of scores. Down here again at the bottom, I just have listed out those calculator commands in case you were struggling to figure out how you would go back and do those 1var stat calculations that we were doing in this video. But what we've covered here is both the range and the IQR calculations. And in the next video, we'll take a look at our final two types of spread measurements, which is going to be our variance and our standard deviation.